Yeah, so you're an angel up in heaven. You've got the job of announcing that the Saviour of the world is to be born, and who do you tell? Would you really choose a bunch of shepherds who couldn't even read and write, let alone post a photo on Facebook? Now, I'm going to take it that nobody actually saw it happen and wrote it down and told Luke. Luke tells us he tried to get his facts right, but he still began by doing what biographers did in his day and often still do today, by using a story to illustrate the character of the person he's going to describe. The story was designed to explain who Jesus was and why he mattered. When he brought shepherds into the story, he wasn't just reporting what somebody had told him, he was making a point about Jesus. So the question is, what is that point about Jesus? Excuse me. The point he was making would have been absolutely obvious to the first people to read his gospel. But 2,000 years later, it's not obvious to us. It needs to be explained. Shepherding had a distinctive social role, both in the Bible and in Galilee at the time of Jesus and Luke. So, here are some biblical texts. Now, I've put them on your handout. You can follow them if you like. But I read out the most important bits. So, we begin at the beginning of the Bible, Genesis 4, the sons of Adam and Eve. Abel was a keeper of sheep and Cain a tiller of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel, for his part, brought of the firstlings of his flock their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. Divine favoritism? What's happening? In the first millennium before Christ, in that part of the world, most families were either agriculturalists or shepherds. If you keep sheep, you move around. If you're an agriculturalist, digging the ground, you stay put. Agriculture produced more food, but only on fertile ground with enough rain. Marginal land could produce enough grass for nomads to feed their sheep for a while before it was all eaten, and then they would move on to somewhere else. Climate change meant that from time to time land would change its use. So marginal land might get wetter and you might be able to grow a bit more, and then if the weather gets drier, then some of the land that you'd been growing crops might only be of use for sheep. So there was some change. And that meant conflict. If you have planted food in your ground, you don't want somebody's sheep coming to eat it all. Conversely, if you know where you're going to feed your sheep next, you don't want to get there and then find that somebody's walled in the ground and is growing crops on it. So there's conflict. The sheep farmers were the poor relations. They were using the land that wasn't so good. The story of Cain and Abel implies that God was on the side of the poor relations, the people on the fringes of society, quite literally on the fringes of the settled land. There was also a different kind of conflict that shepherds faced. Now, I'm going to move on to just about 1,000 years before the time of Jesus. Israel was a loose group of small tribes threatened by a Philistine army. And the Philistines decide, Philistines decide to challenge the Israelites to single combat. and they produced their best fighter, Goliath. And David happens to be there. Now, David is the youngest of many brothers. He was left at home to feed the sheep, not old enough to join the army. But his dad told him to go and join the army to take food to his brothers. So he happened to be there at the time. Right, so he volunteers to fight Goliath. So the text goes, Saul said to David, "You're not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are just a boy, and he's been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and whenever a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down, rescuing the lamb from its mouth. And if it turned against me, I would catch it by the jaw, strike it down and kill it." Right, that was shepherding. The story continues that he killed Goliath with a single stone from his sling. He must have been practicing his slingshots for years. Well, now, moving on 1,000 years, by the time of Jesus, Israel was governed by the Romans. Most people were still farmers. They either owned a small farm of their own or they worked on somebody else's farm. Shepherds no longer owned their own flocks of sheep. They were paid labourers keeping flocks of sheep belonging to other people. The Romans imposed high taxes, which meant that there was much more pressure on land. This made it more likely that sheep would get into farmers' fields. So the historian Ramsay MacMillan summarises, the less populated countryside throughout the empire approached a state of endemic warfare from which only a stout cudgel, a fast horse, or a well-built little fortress gave protection. So that's what it was like in the less populated parts of the countryside. So, by the time of Jesus, Psalm 23 had become an embarrassment. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul." Well, that might have been what the life of the sheep was. But shepherds had become, it was a despised occupation. A shepherd was a person you didn't trust. People often graduated from being a shepherd to being a bandit. There were a lot of bandits in the Roman Empire. The social system simply ignored the large numbers of people who couldn't get an income at all. They survived as long as they could by begging or stealing. So groups of robbers would cooperate by forming groups of bandits. And obviously they couldn't live on farmed land, so they lived on the marginal land, which was where the shepherds were. Now, how do we respond to the decision to become a bandit? Do we condemn them? Do we think they should have just desisted and starved to death? Well, the Roman Empire was a tough place for the poor. 400 years after the time of Jesus, the Christian Bishop Augustine would ask, remove justice, and what are states but gangs of bandits on a large scale? And what are bandits but kingdoms in miniature? So, what is justice? By Augustine's time, the Roman Empire had seen many men progress from shepherd to bandit, and a few progress from bandit, shepherd to bandit to general in the Roman army. One even went shepherd to bandit to general to emperor of Rome. The Romans knew that they governed not because of any natural justice, but by sheer force. The same force as the force that bandits used. In Roman law, justice was whatever the emperor said it was. This is the nature of government by brute force. Of course, it still is. The Jews had a supreme model for this kind of promotion. Their greatest ever king, David, had progressed from shepherd to bandit and from bandit to king. If you read it in the first book of Samuel, it's all there. But the Jewish scripture also offered another model which you won't find in the Roman literature of the time. They appealed to a higher justice than whatever the king decrees. This higher justice is part of the design of the God who created the world. God has provided enough resources to meet everybody's needs. There is no need to drive anybody to such extremes of poverty that they end up having to fight to survive. And many of the laws in the Old Testament describe how this is to work. The point is that God's generosity is a provision for everybody. So, when Luke tells us that the angels sang peace on earth and goodwill to all, the choice of shepherds would have sounded absolutely absurd. Shepherds were the classic troublemakers. Luke did it for a reason. He was giving his readers a foretaste of how the grown-up Jesus would turn out. The adult Jesus would side with the poor and marginalized people of his society, not just the ordinary poor, but the outcasts, the ones everybody hated. And he would do it in the name of the Jewish God, the God of the Jewish scriptures. So, when Augustine asked, remove justice and what are states but gangs of bandits on a large scale, he was writing as a Christian, an inheritor of the Jewish tradition about God. God provides generously for everyone. Peace on earth, goodwill to other people should include everybody. That would be the logic of it. Now, I've talked for too long, and we've got a bit of time. If you would like to talk about this for a bit, I've suggested a few questions on the back of the handout. What does the story of shepherds